Don't you worry, here at Paranormal M, we hear your comments, and I'm here to guarantee you that there is no use of any AI or editing software. All stories that you're about to hear are true accounts, however they may be written, so get ready to unleash your curiosity and unlock the door to the unknown. I'm your companion on the quest for answers to the most perplexing paranormal phenomena. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to embark on this mind-bending adventure. Different premonition. There are a short period in my life where I've been able to predict who I'm going to meet in the day or what's going to happen in that day. It began with my grandma. I suddenly felt that she was visiting at my parents' house, so I called to tell them and she was already there. Another day I took the bus and told my friends that we have to have 2 accidents in a single trip, and this is what happened. I've been able to do that one for about a month with teachers, friends, family, and the last one in this period was the death of a family member. And then it suddenly stopped, and I really felt the stop. You cannot do this anymore. And I also remember that when I was very young, maybe 8, I was on my way home from school alone, and in my head, I've said something like, I'm about to find a red kitty in the next street. And guess what? A very sick red kitty. He was exactly how I saw him in my head. I gave him to a family member because I couldn't take him to school, but I just had news. Recently it came back. I was wondering what it would feel like if I had my nose broken. During the night, I accidentally broke my nose, and 3 more times the following month. It may be coincidental, but I'm not convinced. Here I summarize as much as possible, but I've experienced many paranormal experiences. This is very difficult to find explanations for. I come from the Occitanian culture, which comes from the old times when French and Spanish culture were somehow mixed. There are some hypotheses, but I'd like to have the point of view of several cultures. Today I learned that premonitions run in my family, and I'm looking for answers. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not per se a believer in the supernatural, but I'm also not a denier either. I take the approach of, there's a lot in this world I don't understand, and I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt. But one thing that's been bothering me for as long as I can remember are experiences where I would dream about something bad happening, or get an inexplicable feeling of impending doom, which often is followed by notable circumstances happening shortly after, often bad, but sometimes and rarely good too. The most notable example would be when I explicitly told my brother, CW, suicide. Our dad would either kill himself or one of us soon. And soon after, my father killed himself by accident. Brain tumor caused him to accidentally leave a chainsaw running in the car while he was in it. Caused him to suffocate himself. Notably, a good friend of mine had also given me a tarot card reading of death only a month or so prior. They assured me that the card didn't mean literal death, but change. But I had a strong feeling at the time that in this case the change would be death. Some more subtle but notable things would be my gut feelings about people after I just met them, telling me they're a danger, which would later turn out to be correct, or sometimes just knowing that something is very important about being able to explain how or why. Anyway, this morning I woke up from a nightmare, only to immediately be told by my partner, who woke up before me, about the volcanic eruption. We live in New Zealand, so it's relevant to us. This whole day I've just had a gut feeling that something more is coming, so I've been calling my friends and family to tell them to be careful. And I mentioned the nightmare to my mom. That's when she told me that she never wanted to tell me because she was worried that she'd scare me, but that she herself had been having prophetic dreams all of her life, and she's been suspecting for a long time that I inherited the same ability as her. In short, I'm shocked and honestly a bit scared. I don't know what to make of it. My mom is a very, very religious woman and is strictly against anything superstitious. For her to tell me something so openly is a big deal. So many random things are just coming back to me now, which all seem so impossible, and I guess I just want to hear other people's thoughts and stories. Please don't take this as a story to debunk. Again, I'm sure that there are probably perfectly rational explanations for these things. All of this just brought up memories of how my friend's, conspiracy theorist, father made a big deal about how I have a rainbow chakra or something, and how I sometimes feel like I can see ghosts, even though I don't even strictly believe in them. My eyes catch glimpses of shadows all the time, which I now just jokingly call shadow people. Yeah, I know those are a thing, because they fit the term. Something is in that house. So my fiance used to live in this run-down, extremely old house. We're pretty sure it was actually a barn at one point that was then converted into a home. Well, let me tell you, that house is the most haunted location I've ever stepped foot in to this day. It's been almost 4 years since we've been inside, and we'll never go back. When my fiancée was younger, she was kicked out of her childhood home and went to live with her best friend just down the road. Her room was actually a porch with its own exterior door and a door leading into the living room of the home. Just to set the scene for you a bit, she had vaguely warned me that there was something, quote-unquote, in the house, but I kind of just brushed it off. Well, one night, I went to stay over with her. It was the end of the night, we were both pretty tired, and decided to go to bed. We got underneath the covers, all cuddled up, and not even 2 minutes after turning the lights out and closing our eyes, it happened. It sounded as if something very large and almost animalistic stomped from the other end of her room right up to the side of the bed and began breathing heavily, almost rhythmically, while staring down at us. I know she heard it too because the breathing began to get faster and faster, and the faster that thing was breathing, the tighter she was squeezing me. I never asked her if she felt the same, but I could feel that whatever that thing was, it was evil. We both looked absolutely terrified and couldn't think of what was looming over us like that, both too petrified to even open our eyes. We just laid there, gripping each other out of pure terror. And then all at once, it just stopped. At the very same second, the loud breathing stopped the air around us, and it just got lighter. I shot up, my eyes darting around the room looking for anything to explain what we had just experienced, but there was nothing, just a dark room around us. We slept with all the lights on the rest of that night. A different night that I was there, a glass of a picture frame shattered and woke us up. We would hear running upstairs in the loft, even though there was nobody else in the house, and whispering that sounded like there was someone just outside the window trying to tell you a secret. Something would bang on the door in between her room and the living room while violently shaking the doorknob. One day, an old baby picture of someone neither of us recognized just showed up on her table, and the nightmares I had when I would sleep there were unlike any I'd ever had in my life. but nothing compared to the fear that I felt the night that thing walked right up on us, watching us in bed from less than a foot away. I'll never forget that. Footsteps in my room. I was 11, staying at my father's place for Christmas holidays. The house and the apartment was new. So was the small neighborhood of identical 4-story houses. I was staying in the kids' room that had a bunk bed. The room didn't have much furniture apart from that and the carpet on the floor, because none of my dad's kids were staying there full time. Until my second sister was born later. Anyhow, I was sleeping on the bottom bed. My dad was in the living room playing video games, and he would stay up till 4 or 5 a.m. I was trying to fall asleep when I heard footsteps on the carpet in my room. Soft footsteps that were walking on the carpet, sounding as if they were approaching me. I was facing the wall, too terrified to look behind me. I never felt such fear in my life. Hearing it became so terrifying that I called out to my dad a few times. He would come into the room, sit with me for a few minutes so I'd calm down, but I wasn't able to fall asleep while he was there. He would go back to playing video games, and the footsteps continued. They weren't audible when he was there. Certainly wasn't the sound from his PC in the living room. The sound was clearly in my room. It didn't sound like the neighbors above either. The sound was too clear and soft. I would call out to Dad. He would sit with me, and again he would leave the footsteps, and they would resume. He became annoyed at me after a few times, so I ended up sleeping on the top bed with the lights on. I remember crying and being upset that my dad didn't believe me. After a while being on the top bed, I started to hear purring. I wasn't sure if it was my stuffy nose or actual purring, but at the time, it really calmed me down. A few months ago, before that cat died, and I was still not over it. So it made me happy to hear that, even though it happened in another country, at my mother's place. So I'm not sure about that sound. I fell asleep shortly after. The footsteps didn't happen anymore after that, when I stayed there. Eventually, my dad rented out that apartment. The only other weird instances that happened there, but not in any other place I've lived, is me sleepwalking when I was 8. My dad told me that I would come out of my room and I'd go into the corridor and stare at the front door. Creepiest thing that's happened to me. So I live in a rural place and in a heavily wooded area. I've always felt totally safe in the woods, even at night. I used to go for night walks all the time. I'm not really a skeptic. I do believe in some paranormal things, though I've never had an experience until this one. Regardless, I still always try to find the most logical explanation, and I don't often feel scared or unnerved by things. This experience, however, really freaked me out, and I've been thinking about it ever since it happened, so I thought I'd share. So this was a few weeks ago. My parents had gone to bed, but I wanted to stay up late, so I settled into the living room to read. Our living room has these giant windows almost covering the entire wall. I left the blinds open and turned on one lamp and sat right by the window. My elderly dog, who had been let out already to go to the bathroom for the night and was back inside, started pacing and all throughout the house and barking and wouldn't settle down. This is unlike her. She's super old, so she usually goes right to bed. and she knows not to bark in the house like that. We let her out again, and she walked right back in. We gave her some food, and still, for about an hour, she kept pacing and barking. She wasn't even barking at the windows or looking outside. She just paced up and down the halls and barked at nothing in particular. This kind of weirds me out, but I just shrugged it off, and then she finally settled down to sleep in my parents' bedroom. About 20 minutes later, I'm reading on the couch by the window with my cat when I hear my animal walking outside. I only hear it take a few steps. It sounded large, and I figured that it was probably a deer. My cat jumps up and acts super interested in what's outside, pacing up and down the windowsill and peering out there. Then after a few minutes, the screen of the window furthest from me across the room starts shaking violently, like something is shaking or banging on them very hard. Again, these windows span the whole wall. It startled me, and I looked over. I couldn't make anything out in the dark to see what was outside, and then the shaking and banging grew even more violent, and the windows next to me started shaking too. My cat freaked out and ran out of the room. At this point, I was really scared, and I just did something that you'll probably think is kind of silly. I literally closed my eyes and threw the blanket over my head and waited for it to stop. The shaking and banging lasted for several more seconds. I remember being taken aback at how much force it seemed to have behind it. I just couldn't bring myself to look. I had an awful feeling, and I think if I looked and saw something horrible, it would really traumatize me. It finally stopped, and I stayed under the blanket for 2 entire hours before I could work up the nerve to get up and go to my bedroom. The next morning, after I wake up, I've calmed down a lot and figured it was probably some kind of animal. I went outside to go look at the window to see if I could find tracks or something and look at the screens, but what I found made my skin crawl. There was a single, long, diagonal slash in the window screen of the window that I was sitting right next to. If you're standing in front of where the slash is and looking inside, the slash aligns right over the spot I was sitting, no tracks. So that's creepy as fuck. And what's weird to me is that if it were an animal, why weren't there more slashes? Just one single deliberate slash is strange. There were absolutely no scratch marks or slashes anywhere else on the screens or around the windows, just that one. The other screens were just pretty loose now. If it was a bird, I would have heard wings flapping. I feel like I would have heard animal sounds if it were any other kind of animal. If it was a person, which is even scarier to me, I would think someone would just do something like this, would take it further, and probably would have done more to scare and intimidate than to just shake some windows and slash one and then leave just to scare me. Besides the shaking and banging, there was absolutely no other sounds. And since we live rurally, the chance that it was a person seems more unlikely. It freaks me the fuck out, but there's nothing I can really do about it, other than pop up the trail cairns. Other than put up trail cams. Nothing like this has ever happened to me the entire time I've lived here. A few nights before this happened, I actually started feeling some bad vibes from the woods at night. And to be honest, like I said, I'm normally very at ease with them. But I was out smoking a few nights before in my backyard and just felt like I was being watched. And something was making my skin crawl. And I had been avoiding going outside at night again. And then this happened. This experience really kind of freaked me out. But there's not much I can do except put up some cameras. My grandfather came back to say goodbye. Full disclosure, this happened about 11 years ago. I was 10 years old at the time, I think. But I still remember it. I'm not sure if I'll ever forget. My granddad had gotten cancer. I don't remember what kind it was, but I hadn't thought anything of it when it first started. I assumed he was just getting old. He was in his mid-50s at that time. It was winter break, and my brothers and I were staying at a family friend's house. She and her husband had been friends with my grandparents since before I was born, and they lived about 100 feet away. That night, I had a dream. It was cloudy, I believe, or was it fog? Either way, it was overcast, and my grandfather's white Chevy Silverado was parked out on the street by his and my grandma's house. He was sitting on the toolbox installed on the trunk. I don't remember his exact words, but he said he loved me and he wanted to say goodbye before he left. I was pretty close to my granddad and I was confused. I didn't understand what he was going on about, but I woke up. I didn't understand where he was going either. When I did wake up, my parents were there. I was confused because they usually waited to be called before coming to get my brother and I. They sat us down and explained that our granddad passed away peacefully in his sleep last night. I was really upset, asked my brothers if they had any dreams about him last night. They both said yes, and recounted the exact same dream that I had had. I realized that he had come to say goodbye before leaving. I'm not sure if he visited my grandma as well, but I am sure that he would have let her know that he loved her. Maybe 3 or 5 years ago, I asked my brothers if they remembered this, but they said no. But I know it was real. I was raised Christian, and I know the Lord let him say goodbye to us one last time. I've been keeping that inside for the past 11 years. But I'm not imagining things. My wife has been visiting me. My wife and I were married for 28 years before she passed away 14 months ago. She died of a heart attack, and it was very quick. My 3 teenage children lost their mother, and I lost my best friend. I was in a deep state of shock and grief for the first 6 months. I had a few dreams about her that felt very real. We would have conversations in these dreams, and I just assumed that this was my subconscious dealing with the grief and finding some closure. Then on Valentine's Day, I went to bed. I pulled the sheet over my head, and just as I was falling asleep, someone slaps me in the face 3 times and lays down on top of me. I sit up and it's my wife. And I'm definitely scared, but happy and excited and confused at the same time. I say, "Laura?" And she answers me saying, "Yes, it's me, and I love you." I couldn't see her face because she had her head turned away from me, and I asked her to look at me, and she told me that she couldn't. I just held her, and after a little while, she faded away. The next morning, I called my daughter, and I told her what happened. I told her that her mom had visited me last night. She said that, yeah, Mom visits me in my dreams occasionally. I told her no, she was here with me in person, in the bed with me. My daughter just said, Oh, that's sweet. After about 3 weeks, I had come to the conclusion that I had just hallucinated the whole thing. I know how powerful the mind is, and some very strange things happen when you're dealing with grief. I moved into a new home in March, and one night I was in the living room, and it was cold in the house, maybe 55 degrees. I was getting ready to go to bed when I noticed that I could see my breath. Because even though it was cold, it certainly wasn't that cold. I laid down in bed, and right before I fell asleep, I felt my dog climb into the bed and scoot up against my back. I was laying on my side, and I thought it was weird because my dog doesn't normally get in bed with me. I was looking at the bedroom door into the living room when I see my dog walk by. So of course I freak out and roll over quickly, and there she is, my wife again. Only this time I can see her face and it's completely black. I mean, like black as midnight. I tell her I love her. She says I love you. And I ask about her skin. And she says apparently that's something that happens where she's at. We have a very long conversation. She tells me that she's made some friends and it's okay where she's at. She also says it's very cold. She tells me that she's with me. She's going to stay with me. And after a while, she fades away. This has happened probably 10 more times since March. We've had sex a couple of times, but mostly we just hold each other and talk. More often than not, I keep a sheet between us. I normally sleep with a sheet above me, and she normally smacks me on the face 2 or 3 times to get my attention. This is very real, and I'm just relaying something new that's happening in my life that I think most people in the subreddit might be interested in. I know I was, as the narrator. A ghost waited until I had laryngitis to attack. TLDR at the bottom. Obligatory, this happened in 2017. FYI, my room is in the basement and had a hopper window with a streetlight outside, so my room wasn't pitch black but very lightly illuminated. Still too dark to make features out from across a room with the lights off, though. I, a 25-year-old female, was laying in bed facing the wall, and my bed was pushed against, and it felt like someone was over near my closet across the room looking at me. My back was to the closet, but I could just feel it, so I turned around and got my phone flashlight. Nothing was there. Okay. I went back to sleep. A few days go by, and I feel like somebody's looking at me again. My back is to my closet again. I'm facing the wall. This time they feel closer, like in the middle of my room between the closet and my bed. I grab my phone flashlight and look. Nothing. Back to sleep. Facing my room this time because I swear I've been feeling something looking at me and getting closer and closer every few days. I was starting to get terrified. So like a week goes by, and I feel it getting closer and closer, but I see nothing every time. Eventually, my back is to my room again, and I feel like it's standing right at the side of my bed, standing over me. I turned around quick, no flashlight, looked up and saw nothing, but it felt like it was there, staring at me. I grabbed my phone flashlight without looking away or blinking. Nothing. I go back to sleep eventually. A few more days go by and I'm sick, laryngitis, no voice, the whole 9. My friend, a 25-year-old male, lived with me and my parents at this time. This was like 5 years ago. He was upstairs because I lived in the basement and his room was upstairs. My back is to my room. I feel it staring again, except it feels far away, like back at my closet across the room. I have no voice, remember this. I look at my closet in the dark and stare while reaching for my phone. I'm scared and it feels different this time. Angry. I don't blink or take my eyes off of the closet. I see a black outline of what looks like a woman in a long dress, like 1800s style. Maybe my imagination. I finally get my flashlight on. Before I can point it at my closet, it comes rushing towards me, still all black. Not walking, just gliding directly towards me, very swift. I scream, no voice. It doesn't touch me as it goes away from the phone's flashlight as it lit up the room. I scream and crawl to the end of my bed and flick the light on again. I'm screaming my friend's name, help! But no voice. I call his phone. He's upstairs and I can barely make words because the no voice thing, and I whisper, come help. He comes and I'm hyperventilating in my bed, holding my knees, staring at the closet. I tell him whispering what happened and how I felt it building up for weeks, but ghosts terrify me, and I didn't want to give it energy by entertaining it or telling anyone. He takes me upstairs and I sleep on the couch, and he sleeps in the armchair. I sleep in the living room for a few nights. He eventually tells me that when he falls asleep on the couch, sometimes he hears someone walk back and forth in the kitchen and stop on the ledge where the kitchen goes into the living room. But he doesn't ever see anything. Nothing ever happened to me again, and I never saw or felt anything again since then. A house ruined my 2 years of life. I moved into this house in July of 2016, and it was just my father and I. It was a nice 3-bedroom house in a nice, well-kept neighborhood on the outskirts of town. When I first visited the house for a viewing, it was like a dream, and it was the only house that we had seen that really stood out to us. We eventually ended up choosing it because of how much we loved it. There were no negative feelings, no feelings of sickness, nothing. But as soon as we moved in, things started to change in ways that we couldn't really understand. Doors would close on their own. Lights would shut off or on after you've left a room. The unmistakable sound of someone in the garage and back porch, and just an overall sense of unease. The house always felt like it held heavy air, and that sense of ease never lifted. Even when I had friends over, nothing ever seemed to help. At night, it felt like you were being watched from the corners of the room, and the only room I felt safe in at any point was my room. But I often sort of cleansed it and burned incense frequently to keep up with ritualistically. That seemed to help a lot, but keeping that room energy free. The first instance I can remember so vividly, it still shakes me to my core. It was during my first month of living there. I had been sleeping on the couch in the living room because there was just something about my bedroom that kept me from sleeping. The only place I felt comfortable enough to sleep had been the living room. I remember falling asleep around 10 p.m. and had a very, very strange dream, from which I woke up from another dream that still makes me horribly anxious to think about. I had woken up and slowly started to sit up. I was in my living room where I had fallen asleep, but my body felt very heavy, and it felt physically like I was laying down on my couch, but I was very much sitting up. It was still dark out, and started to look for my phone, when a figure down the hall by my dad's door caught my attention. It was a very tall and dark figure standing there. It was darker than the hall around it, and it felt downright aggressive, like I had done something personally to offend it. But before I could even move, it was charging at me. I felt the floor shake and heard the sound of rustling fabric and very deep labored breathing, which only stopped as I shot awake, sitting up from the couch. Nothing was out of place. The only thing that had hinted something having been there was my cat, who had his back hunched and was hissing toward the hallway. Luckily, it was roughly 7 a.m., and the sun started to rise. I didn't move from my spot till the entire room was covered in the light of the sun. When my dad lost his job was when I was about 18 and we had to sell the house. Things started to stir when everything started to be moved out of the house. Due to my dad having to get a job in the city, he was going to move in with his friend, who lived not far from said city. He was going to help me get an apartment when I turned 18, since we were likely going to sell the house after my birthday. Well, that left me alone in the house by myself after my dad moved out, only coming down on weekends to take me into town to get food as I couldn't drive at the time. During this time, I moved my bed into the now empty living room because my room began to feel so unsafe and heavy. At this point, I was cleansing my room and house every day, but it never made it feel any better. The only place I felt I could be safe and watch over the house was in the living room, so that's where I stayed. When I would turn off the lights to go to bed, I would hear footsteps walking up and down the hall, never approaching the living room, and eventually they would stop, but not before they would start to speed walk toward the living room and just stop a few feet shy of the living room. Sometimes I would hear knocking in the kitchen when the cats would be laying with me, and the dog would already be with my dad. They'd be a knock here, and then almost rhythmic for a few seconds, and then stop. Every night I experienced terrible night terrors that I couldn't wake up from, where a man with an unidentifiable face would be screaming somewhere in the house and would wake me up and then would come storming out into the living room. At this point, he would point at me and continue yelling before stomping up to me as I scrambled to get away. He got on top of me and started strangling me. And as he did this, his face would distort into this terrifying face I can't even begin to describe, while the house would begin to set ablaze. This happened every night until I moved out. Some smaller instances where I was living there. The sound of a man yelling and screaming in the garage, throwing tools around, and very loud music. But when you'd go to check out, you'd just be met with a dark, dead, silent, and untouched garage. Couldn't have been from my neighbors either. We lived in a cul-de-sac. My neighbors were placed just far enough that you could barely see their front door. From the street, my house and the other house were one of the only houses that you really can see the front door, while the street and all the other houses are the ones that you could hear. And our neighbors were always quiet besides when their family and friends would come over. I would constantly wake up with bruises all over my body, but they often looked like fingers. There was usually 2 or 3 in the same place, and would often sort of take time in the mirror to see the bruises that weren't actually there on my face, my neck, and my torso, and had people point out bruises that would be gone in minutes, if not seconds. My grandmother left me flowers after her death. First off, I was very close to my grandmother. I was her first grandchild, and we had the most amazing bond. Now, as a 27-year-old man, I still occasionally feel this happy urge to go and visit her, even though she's been gone for years. She taught me a lot of things, including gardening, which was one of her favorite things to do. We used to garden together, which later made me buy my own allotment to grow vegetables and flowers. So I had owned said allotment for a couple of weeks when my grandmother came to visit me. She was so proud with what I had done to the place, and then she told me that she had cancer, and that she probably wouldn't survive long enough to see all the flowers in the garden blossom. Broke my heart. Within weeks, she was in intensive care. When I visited her in hospice, just hours before she died, she was in a coma, and I begged her to let go, which she did. My family owns a house just by a fjord, a river. My grandparents also used to have a house there, so my grandmother had just wished to have her ashes spread over the water so she would still be close to us. I'd picked her favorite flowers from my allotment as my last gift to her. I put the flowers in the water as well as a sip of beer, which she also enjoyed. 2 weeks later, I get a call from my mom. She just wanted me to know that 3 yellow flowers had appeared on their private pier overnight. The flowers are not indigenous to my country and actually quite rare to come across. They were just as fresh as if they had been cut. Needless to say, we were all shocked, mostly because only my mom and me knew those yellow flowers were a favorite. My dad and brothers would have never thought of it, let alone pulled a prank on us. As a reminder, I have one of those flowers tattooed on my arm. The new house I built on my allotment bears her name, and every spring I plant dozens of these bulbs in her memory. It could all mean a prank, but in my heart, I know it wasn't. She just wanted to let me know that she was still around. Something followed me from a psychiatric hospital. So I've been back and forth on whether or not to tell this story, mostly because it involves some aspects of my working life that I'm not at liberty to discuss, but also because I had a severe personal implication for me. Anyway, I've decided to share it here, and I hope you understand why these things I simply can't go into detail about. This all started in December of 2020. As a part of my education, I was scheduled for a 6-month internship at a psychiatric hospital. I had previous experience with working with this type of patient, so I was really excited about it. I switched around 4 different wards in the hospital, so I treated a lot of different people with a lot of different problems. I was curious about all the different aspects, so I never said no to any task, which meant I came across everything from murderers, pedophiles, to suicidal teenagers with personality disorders. In my work life, I've had people spit at me, verbally and physically assault me, throw shit at me, and all that stuff. So I'd like to think I'm a pretty tough guy. Besides that, I always carried a personal assault alarm. One press of a button, staff from every ward would be there in a matter of seconds. On one of the wards, I quickly noticed that there was a certain room which was monitored 24/7 by a guard. To be clear, this is a pretty normal procedure, either because the patient is physically abusive, suicidal, or restrained. But most patients get the watch pulled off of them relatively quickly. I asked a colleague and she told me that it was a female patient, let's just call her Anne, who's extremely aggressive and psychotic beyond belief. At that point, Anne had been restrained to her bed for 3 months. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We have a really strict procedure when it comes to restraining people with belts. By the way, they're soft belts made of fabric, not leather. So restraining the patient really is absolutely last resort that we go to. I asked the cheap psychiatrist, what was up with this girl? And he just scuffed and said, if only I knew, but honestly, she defies logic. He told me that at first, they thought that she was psychotic, but her symptoms only got worse, no matter how much different medication they tried. Then they thought she might have suffered a trauma and was in a dissociative state, but that still didn't fit the profile of her symptoms. She had gone from being a perfectly normal woman in her 20s to being violent, extremely aggressive, and unable to speak in just 4 months. That is practically unheard of, especially as no drugs were involved. We regularly take a toxicology check of all patients and always when they're admitted. One day my alarm went off. They're all connected, so I know where I need to go to run to help my colleagues. I immediately knew it had to be Anne, and I was right. She had only had her legs and torso fixated. Again, normal procedure if the patient otherwise is relatively calm. She had defecated in her hand and thrown it at the guard watching her. She then proceeded to bite her fingers so hard that 3 or 4, can't remember the exact number, had really bad fractures. Both her hands were a bloody mess, and she needed like 50 stitches afterwards. It wasn't the blood or the fact that she would throw her own shit at us. I had seen that loads of times, but the screams this woman made. It was the most primal, guttural, and terrifying sound I've ever heard. It scared me shitless. The best way I can describe it is something like a bear growling and a mountain lion hissing and spitting all at the same time. I've seen my fair share of people in primal distress, but I could have never imagined that a person could make a sound like that. As an intern, I'm in no way allowed to use force, so I was just watching as 7 of my colleagues tried to fixate her to her bed. They had serious trouble pinning her down. Remind you that these are really experienced people. At last, we called a medicinal alarm, which immediately calls for a chief psychiatrist to make decisions. He decided to forcefully medicate her. They gave her 1 and then a second shot. Only seemed to piss her off, even though it should have put a bear to sleep. At the 3rd injection, she calmed enough to where they could restrain her. She never nodded off. She just breathed heavily and kept staring up at the same corner of the room, sometimes smirking at something only she could see. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back at the ward. It was relatively calm and on the weekend, so there really wasn't much to do. Anne was in one of their good periods, so she had had her restraints removed. A guard was always by her, though. I was sitting in the office when suddenly I see Anne walking in the hallway without the guard. I don't know if he had taken a bathroom break or whatever, but he wasn't around. So I caught up with her. I asked her what she was doing in the hallway alone, but of course she didn't respond. I should mention that many of my colleagues were afraid of Anne, and rightfully so, even though everyone is aware that it's the illness and not the person attacking you, but when it keeps happening, that patient does catch some stigma. I, for one, always try to look at the person and not the illness. So I asked where we were going. She took me by the arm and led me to the common area. She went over to a book cabinet, turned and looked at me and muttered, "Read book." I was completely taken back by the fact that she was speaking. She pulled out a random book and handed it to me. Then she sat down on the floor and started rocking back and forth. I joined her on the floor and started reading the book. It was just some random old book, probably from a charity, and it had no special meaning, But as I read, she came closer and closer to me. Then she cuddled up on me, put her head on my lap, and fell asleep. One of my colleagues came by and she looked absolutely shocked. And before I knew it, 5 or 6 people, including the chief psychiatrist, was looking at me reading this random book out to her. I caught a lot of praise for this, which is actually nice. But then things took a turn for the worst, at least for me. It started one night when I was home alone. It was a completely normal night for me, until I heard something from upstairs coming down the stairs. The best way to describe it is like a big dog thrashing and tumbling down the stairs. You know, like when a dog rushes down the stairs to greet you. But this was bigger, much bigger. I could hear the weight of something tumbling down while nails or claws or whatever slid on the steps. I got up thinking that somehow there was a massive animal in my house. But there was nothing there. That scared the ever-living shit out of me. I had never had anything like that happen to me. I left the house and stayed the night with my parents. But I also had strange effects on my body. Like I had a filter over my eyes or something. Everything started to seem out of focus, like tunnel vision, but with a massive blur added to it. And then I started to disassociate. Had this feeling of being totally cut off from the contact of my body. Then came the panic attacks. My girlfriend called an ambulance one of the times because I was on the verge of a heart attack. The paramedic said I had a heart rate of 240. I've had no prior problems with my psyche, but I figure it was stress. I have suffered from sleep paralysis before, but never with hallucinations, or whatever you want to call it. But that started recently. I see a large black mass with long arms and legs sit in the right corner of our bedroom, like a massive spider, but just with 4 legs. This is now happening on a nightly basis. A couple of days ago, I told my girlfriend about it, because she kept pestering me with questions about my nightmares. She said, "That's funny. Every time you're about to go to sleep, you look up in that corner and you just sort of smirk." That reminded me of Anne. And now I'm absolutely terrified that I might have brought something home. Believe it or not, that's up to you. I've never treated a patient like Anne, and none of my colleagues had either. It was scary stuff. And I've never suffered from any psychological problems before, never. But something's going on, I'm sure of it. It feels like it wants to get back at me or something. I don't know. And by the way, Anne is much better today. She's in a rehabilitation home where she thrives. One day she might even be able to have a normal life. A bizarre taxi home. We were in Belfast, North Ireland, and it was around 4:30. A group of friends and I had just left a party, and while they were all very much not sober, I'm straight edge, and I can recall this clearly. We tried calling for a taxi. However, there was an awkward number of us, so we couldn't get into one and have it carry all of us. So we decided to tramp home. It was about a 35-minute walk, so not that far. However, it had been a big session, and we were all pretty done, just moaned about not having a ride when a random old-fashioned black taxi, think like a London cab, pulled up alongside of us. These taxis usually hold 5 to 6 passengers max in the back section, but this had 9 seats, 1 for each of us. The door opened by itself, and everyone climbed in without even saying a word. It proceeded to drive us to our destination. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but we all spent the whole ride in silence. The cab smelled so bad that I didn't even want to breathe, and the interior was old and very dirty, with the floor even having a few small holes. Looking into the driver's cab, the driver was a very old man, looked to be 70 years old maybe, wearing an old tattered suit with an old newsboy cap on his head. But weirder still, a man in his late 20s was sat in his passenger seat, wearing ripped and dirty sweatpants and a dirty jumpsuit with stains all over it. Neither of these guys spoke the entire trip to each other or to any of us. It was just silence the whole way. Not even the radio was on. When we arrived at our destination, I herded my intoxicated group of friends out of the taxi, but when I turned to pay the fare, the taxi was gone and the road was completely clear in both directions. We all got into my friend's house and nobody spoke a word of what happened until the next day when the most wasted of the group told us about the trip that he had the night before. I'm not sure what the hell happened that night. All I know is that we were a group of Catholics in a Protestant part of town, and getting into a random car was the dumbest shit I've ever done. Somehow, even though it stank, it was clearly wrong in every way. It felt like it was exactly what I should have done at the time. Negative entity taking the form of my father. For some backstory, I was very interested in the paranormal from a young age. My father and my brothers told me of an encounter that they had while staying at a hotel in London, and that was enough for me to believe in something being out there. When I was in middle school, I was allowed to have sleepovers at my best friend's home, and she warned me about the hauntings that she experienced overnight. I saw shadow figures, watched doors open, heard footsteps, and many more things at that house. I have a very distinct memory of sleeping over one night, waking up at exactly 3 a.m., watching the bedroom door open, and feeling something coming toward me. I doubt this is related to the encounter I'm about to explain, but I'm including in case anybody may think it's due to the severity of the experiences that I'd had in that house. After having experienced those things, I woke up one night at 3 a.m. in my own home, rolled over in my bed, and saw a very clear figure of a man looking out my bedroom window. It looked to me just like my dad, who was still very much alive and was sleeping down the hall. So I said out loud, "Dad, what are you doing?" The figure turned to look at me, in which I was able to see it. It did in fact look exactly like my father. However, I knew it was not him. It looked back at the window. So I closed my eyes for a minute, and when I opened them, the figure was gone. I know I wasn't dreaming, because when I opened my eyes, I also dropped my iPod on the ground. And when I woke up the next morning, it was on the ground in the exact position I dropped it. Also, to be sure, I asked my father if he came to check on me during the night, and he assured me that he did not. Really, what I'm getting at here is, I'm wondering if anybody has an idea of what type of spirit or entity would appear this way. I've read about negative spirits appearing as people you know, or somebody that looks less threatening. And I'm even thinking that maybe something followed me home from my friend's home. I lived in that house for another 10 years or so and never had another encounter there. I'd love to hear what anybody else thinks about this. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Before we moved out together, I would stay at his place until around 1 a.m., and I would park my car sideways at the very top of the gravel driveway, making a tea. In the gravel driveway, there were always 2 cars parked, and the one closest to my car would be one that his brother had been working on for a while. It didn't drive. Anyways, one night I was about to head to my car, And usually I don't mind walking up there alone, but that night, my fiancé said that he wanted to walk with me because it was a pretty night. While we were passing his brother's car on his left, we heard a little bang. Don't exactly know what it could have been. We both looked over and I immediately saw what looked to be someone ducked behind the car with its head just a little bit up where we could see his eyes looking at us. With it being dark, I was questioning if I was seeing what I thought. So I looked over at my fiancé and saw him staring in that direction as well. He apparently thought that maybe it was his neighbor, which was our age, and we knew him pretty well. Just maybe he was messing with us, so he called out his name. Right as he did, the head ducked out of sight. My fiancé, knowing I had to get home and us both being confused, put me behind him and walked to the driver's side of my car, which is on the other side of his brother's car, where we saw the person. We were both expecting someone to be there, but once we got to that side, no one was there. We were both so confused, like we should have heard the gravel if they moved. Where could they have moved? The car was too low to the ground to get under it. There wasn't anything else nearby for them to hide behind. And again, how did we not hear the gravel move if they moved? Obviously, it could have been someone just trying to steal tools out of his brother's car, but all of it was still weird. We couldn't explain how it just disappeared. Anyways, he never let me walk up to the driveway at night by myself after that. It didn't have a mouth. This happened in September of 2020 in Aiken, South Carolina. I didn't grow up there, and we only ever lived there for about 6 months, so I'm not too familiar with the area. Some of these details are pretty boring, but I think it helps explain the setting and the situation better, so I'm going to give them regardless. My fiancé, G, had reconnected with an old family friend from high school, B, and we decided to rent his basement, which was renovated into a separate apartment while we looked for a place of our own. The house is not in a neighborhood, it's pretty rural in the area, in my opinion. We kind of had neighbors, but each house had several acres of land separating them. B had 2 large adult dogs, probably 55 to 65 pounds, and our dog was a little smaller than them at the time. The dogs would run around and play in the woods at the edge of the backyard. Everything was good for the first few weeks. Then, at night, we started feeling very unnerved if we had to go outside. I know it sounds so cliché, but it felt like something was standing in the woods staring at us. If we went somewhere after dark, we would do a speed walk, almost run from where we parked out in front all the way around the side of the house to the backyard, which is where our entrance was. Then we started hearing it, quote unquote. As I mentioned earlier, the dogs ran and played in the woods, so we were very aware of what it sounded like when a 60-pound creature was rambling around in the woods. This was much larger, so much bigger. It wasn't just the 3 of us hyping each other up to be scared either. Anyone that came to hang out, there was a pool in the backyard, so we had a fair amount of visitors, would hear it, and no one ever stayed outside after sunset. We thought it was a bear, to be honest, because whatever was making the noise was huge, much larger than a person, so a bear is the only thing that really fits in our minds. A few months go by, and we find our own place, and we were in the process of moving out when this occurred. My fiancé was up at the car, arranging the boxes so that we could maximize the space that we had available. I had just carried a box up to him and was walking back around the side of the house, from the front to the backyard, and it was sloped downhill a little bit. As I was walking down to go around from the side and back up to the house, I saw it, staring dead at me, straight into my eyes. Pretty sure my heart stopped beating for a few seconds. I completely froze up. Some instinct inside of me made me begin walking again. I felt like I shouldn't run, but try to act normal and get my ass inside. As soon as I got inside, I shut and locked the door, but immediately had to unlock it to open it back up because I couldn't lock my fiancé outside with this thing. I immediately started seeing these gruesome, gory pictures in my head. Pictures of me and my fiancé, beheaded, completely mangled and broken, laying on the floor of our apartment with everything that was left in the apartment smashed on the ground around us. Then right after that, something like, "No, that's not what it will do. My fear of the unknown is making me unreasonable. If I let it in, it won't be like that." I kept having the weirdest urge to basically invite it in, which is absurd because the door was cracked open. Honestly, even if it had been shut and deadbolted, if that thing wanted in, I'm pretty sure it would have gotten in. I was torn. I wanted to call out to my fiancé, but I didn't want to startle this thing by yelling. And I didn't want my fiancé to come rushing down the door and have that thing spring on him and attack him. Finally, I couldn't take it and I yanked the door open. I was planning on running to the car, but my fiancé was right there and he had seen the thing too, and he had been watching it watch us. The second it turned and disappeared into the woods, he rushed down to the door. This thing was super tall, super skinny, and a sickly shade of whitish gray that had brightly lit up glowing eyes. One very crazy detail, that I swear the eyes were a golden color. My fiancé swears that they were red. I don't understand any of this, but especially that part. The worst part of its appearance, however, was that it didn't have a mouth. Besides its bright eyes, the rest of its face was just skin, tightly stretched, but perfectly smoothed out skin on its face. WTF. I have never in my life felt such a shock, like just a feeling in my heart that something was so wrong, as I did when I saw that thing looking into my eyes with its smoothed out skin where it should have a mouth. How do you eat if you have no mouth? How do you stay alive if you can't eat? Sometimes I worry that I honestly had the chance to meet and interact with a completely different species, and I blew it by being judgmental and fearful. This thing wasn't like me, so I was deathly afraid of it. Did I have a reason to be afraid? If I had wanted to hurt us 100% positive it could have. My fiancé said that he could feel the evil radiating off of it, that I need to quit beating myself up because it did not have friendly intentions. I know that this sounds so totally and utterly fake that it's absurd. I wouldn't believe this if somebody else posted it. I'm just wondering if anyone else has ever seen anything like this. And if they have, maybe they can tell me what the fuck this thing is. For months after it happened, I wouldn't talk about it. Anytime my fiancé brought it up, I would shut the conversation down. I didn't want to even think about it, because I was scared that it would just feel me thinking of it somehow and would come back and find me again. We don't live near there anymore, and now that I know that there's an irrational fear anyways, I've never told anybody about it, and neither has my fiancé. I couldn't bear to spill my guts to someone I'm close to about the situation that was so intensely terrifying and borderline traumatic. I know that seems so drama queenish, but it's legit the most fearful experience of my life. And have them look in my eyes and not believe me? It would destroy my relationship with the person, and I don't want that to happen. I don't have many people that I'm close to, and I would just prefer to keep them. Thanks for reading, and if you have any ideas what this thing is, please let me know. ETA. I talked to my fiance this morning regarding this whole experience. Usually he brings it up and I shut the conversation down immediately. This is the second real conversation, and in my opinion, more than a few sentences, that we've had about it. He told me that he didn't see red eyes, that they were a bright white light bulb, a light bulb. But to me, they weren't white. That makes more sense, though, than two completely different colors. We were in two different elevations and also different distances from it. So maybe the light was reflecting strangely, and maybe we just weren't paying too much. Maybe we just weren't paying too much attention at its eye color because we were trying to figure out what the hell we were looking at. Also, we were in North Augusta, SC. The road we lived off of was Old Aiken Road. I guess that's why I mistakenly said it happened in Aiken. Seance gone wrong. When I, a female, was 12 years old, my twin and I were super into ghosts and would watch ghost shows on TV all the time. One thing that we watched was a segment where they'd take a cup, turn it so it would bottom up. Everyone in the circle would put their finger on it. They called this a seance, and they'd ask yes or no questions, and if the cup moved, that it was supposed to mean yes. So obviously my siblings and I had to try this. One summer day while our parents were gone, my twin, a 12-year-old female, and my stepbrother, 10-year-old male, dragged the coffee table into our bedroom and closed the door. We had the cup, and we all put our pointer finger on the cup and started asking if anything was there. At first, we could tell stepbro was messing with us and trying to move it without us noticing, so we told him that he wasn't going to take it seriously to just leave. My twin and I stayed seated, and stepbro goes to leave, but right as his hand touches the door handle, the cup started moving in a clockwise fashion, sort of slowly. Of course, I'm not moving it. I ask my twin if she's moving it. She says no and is looking a little bit worried. Stepbro was watching from the door, and the cup starts moving a bit faster. I take my finger off the cup and go towards stepbro, watching in horror as the cup continues to move faster and faster. Bless my twin because she held on a bit longer, but eventually the cup was moving so fast her hand wouldn't stay on even if she had wanted it to be there. The three of us run screaming out of that room. The cup is still moving and no one's touching it anymore. I have no explanation for what happened. All of us ran screaming from that room, and the cup eventually ended up on the floor. Honestly, I have no idea how it flew off, because I was gone. Still one of the most bizarre things I've ever experienced. Is my home haunted? All right, so this happened around 6 months ago or so. I live with my grandma, and sometimes she leaves days on end to visit her sister and leaves me home alone. Now this house is old, and we live in a forested area. Weird noises and all that fun stuff occur all the time. However, this was different. One of the days my grandmother was gone, I was awoken at 3 a.m. I know it was 3, and I know I was awake because I checked my phone to see the time. What woke me up was what I heard. It was my front door opening, which was odd to me because my grandma hates driving at night, but I still assumed that my grandma was home. I turned off my phone and rolled on my bed to face the bedroom door. I hear some creaks, and this is when shit gets weird. I don't know if I just fell asleep really quick or if this shit actually happened, but as I was looking at my door, with my head under the pillow, I saw what appeared to have been my door open with a hand dangling by my room light. I once again just assumed that this was my grandma and went back to sleep. In the morning I woke up, called for my grandma just to find out that she never came home. Now, this is when I had a small freak out because I was awakened by my front door opening. Yeah, I locked all the doors. This was day 1. Day 2 of my grandma being gone was my small freak-out day. I double-checked everything. My front door was locked, my back door was locked. Everything was just the way I left it. My day went on normally. When nighttime hit, the entire time I just had this feeling I was being watched, observed. I closed the blinds to my house and essentially locked myself in my room. I was watching some Star Trek with my window open and heard branches and leaves crack outside. Living in a forested area, I assumed it was a deer or rabbit, so I gave it a quick glance, opened my bedroom blinds a small amount, and well, it obviously was dark, but I saw nothing. Nothing that could have made a sound of branches breaking like that right out by my window. Nothing creepy happened that night, but I still felt uneasy. When my grandma finally comes home, everything went back to normal. No more uneasy feeling or feeling of being watched. However, now whenever she leaves for multiple days, it does come back.